experience because it makes you feel old and it makes you feel like maybe it's time for you to be the historic person. So, but I'm going to try and wear that hat for a second here and tell you a little bit about where I think the area of the field of peer relations could be headed. Let's see. There's no way that I can do so without recognizing that, there are many, many amazingly brilliant people who are working in the area of peer relations, and anything that I am offering in this talk in order to guide us in a conversation about what the future of this area is coming from my idolizing and voracious reading of a random sample of people on this list is a random sample of hundreds of people who have done amazing work in the area of peer relations. I also want to say that I've been standing on the shoulders of a former postdoc of mine, Matteo Gilletta. For years, we wrote this massive thing from Dante Giacchetti, because if he asks you to do this, you can't say no. And anything good that will come in this kind of overview is absolutely coming from Matteo, and I am channeling him, but without the Italian accent. It's hard to talk about the future of peer relations research without talking about the past. And like I said, it feels very funny to be talking about the history when we're really only going back to the 60s and the 70s. I have a personal interest in believing that things that are around only since 1970 are actually still very young, but okay. It's a young area of research, right? So if we think about clinical child and adolescent psychology, we think about the influence of families and environment, and we really don't come up to talking about peers until way after the days of at least 50, 60 years of thriving research in clinical child. But it was around this time that there were a couple of studies, I'll talk about one really briefly, done by Cohen, where they were trying to figure out, and this was a follow-back study, how they can, what are some of the factors in archival school records that might differentiate those who ended up experiencing a need for psychiatric treatment in adulthood versus those who did not. This was an 11 to 13 year follow back of study, like I mentioned, using school records from grades 1 through 3. And sure enough, they had a class play nomination procedure in the data set, which is a peer nomination or a sociometric procedure. Well, what they did was they looked at everything, and they looked at those who had registered for psychiatric treatment and those who did not. And they had controlled for everything in this analysis. This is pretty old here, but they were looking at all kinds of measures of IQ and achievement, teacher ratings, anxiety, overall teacher ratings. But what they found was the one factor that seemed to differentiate those who experienced psychiatric treatment versus those who did not were things that came from the peer nomination measure. It was these kids' peer relationships that seemed to make a difference more than many of these other factors, and these came out significant. So this began a number of studies, and this is a complicated slide just to tell you that this research kind of began here at school-age children. What you could see here was that there was a lot of research, therefore, looking at these peer nominations, things like likability, popular, rejected, neglected, controversial, and average. And over the years, there was some research really looking at some of the determinants of those behaviors. People started to recognize that you can have a really close friend, even if you're rejected, which started an area of research on friendships. People started to look developmentally at behaviors you can understand at infancy, toddlers, school age, and adolescence. There was a big research area when I was getting my dissertation on families and peer linkages. There was look at early peer and social play, which led to a discussion of temperament, parent-child heritability. Around the early 90s, there was starting to be talk of overt versus relational aggression. Then Lindsay Lohan and Mean Girls. There was talk about functions of aggression, like proactive and reactive aggression with peers. Peer victimization became particularly big to study in America after the Columbine disaster. We saw more research in adolescence then, looking at peer cliques and networks, peer crowds, looking at those breakfast club types of reputations. Romantic relationships became an area of peer relationships. The kind of popularity that's based on everyone thinking that you're popular rather than those that you like very much became really differentiated somewhere in the late 90s. Peer influence started to become a really popular topic of study. followed by ultimately online peer interactions. And all of this needs to be done with consideration of gender, race, ethnicity, and culture. And that's kind of summarizing for you the last 50 years just in one slide of what we've already done in the past. However, in the clinical child and adolescent psychology area, almost all of that research has essentially been looking at one bivariate association between two variables, those constructs of peer relations that I just showed you, and indices of adjustment difficulties or psychopathology. And although there's some research that looks at how those experiencing psychopathology might experience difficult peer relations, particularly research among those with ADHD or PDD or anxiety, the vast majority of the peer relations research has really been looking at how those peer experiences predict psychopathology over time. But maybe that's not all we need to look at. Maybe, in fact, peer relationships have an impact that's far greater than us just thinking about psychopathology. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit here. This is something that's been coming out in the last 5 years or so with a lot more research interest than we've seen before. This is one study that I'm going to tell you about that came from collapsing 4 giant national databases that were all longitudinal. There's the AdHealth database, of course, which followed kids for about 12 years. There's a midlife developmental database, which followed folks for about 9 years. I refuse to call ages 50 and up elderly, so I'm going to call this middle age as well. And then finally, a little bit older, each following folks for 8 or 5 years, thousands and thousands of folks. And a research study that was done actually here at UNC, some analyses, simply coded in all of those studies measures for 2 independent variables. One was the frequency of social interactions, and the second was the quality of those social interactions. Now, the social interactions were including family as well as peer relationships, but as you'll see, the coding of that did include mostly friends, peers, in a variety of different types of settings or relationship contexts, as well as family. And again, looking at the quality of social relationships as a predictor. What they did was, I went ahead and I'm showing you the results here across each of the different age groups that were associated. What they did was they tried to look at whether the presence of peer relationships and high quality peer relationships might be predictive of 3 measures of health outcome: C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation, hypertension, and obesity. And I'm going to show you the results for the elderly, for later adulthood, middle adulthood, young adulthood, and adolescence. What you'll see here is, by no surprise, those that are elderly had high odds ratios. This is a 1.4 odds ratio. In other words, these folks are about 40% more likely to have C-reactive protein measures indicating high rates of inflammation if they had poor quality peer relationships. You can see also there was an elevated risk for hypertension and an elevated risk for obesity. And that doesn't surprise us, right? We can even see here in the pandemic that when people are socially isolated or where older people have poor peer relationships, they're probably at risk for worse health outcomes. If we look at folks in later adulthood, we can see that the effects were a little bit less. And if we look at middle adulthood, we could see the effects were even less still. But here's something that might be interesting. If we look at those in young adulthood, and if we look at those in adolescence, the effects go back up, suggesting again that the effects of poor social relationships among adolescents or young adults increases the risk of these health outcomes more than it does when people are around middle-aged. In fact, in some cases, it's not that much less than the effects for the elderly, really suggesting there might be something very unique about poor peer relationship experiences at young ages that might be particularly important to investigate. By the way, these findings, I'm explaining them in a simplistic way, but of course they controlled for a wide array of possible variables and third variables and covariates. As far as looking at the quality of peer relationships, as I mentioned before, if we compare the effects of things that we spend a lot of our time and energy on in terms of public health dollars, the effects of young adolescents, poor peer relationships on C-reactive protein outcomes is not terribly different than the effects of physical inactivity on inflammation, or the effects of diabetes on hypertension. So these are powerful effects. A study done by Holt-Lundstad, now about 10 years ago or so, did a similar type of analysis, but rather than looking at a cross-section of epidemiological databases, she looked at a variety of individual studies, about 148 of them, with 300,000 people from all across the world. The baseline age in her study was from, her meta-analysis was from 6 to 85 years old, and participants across all these studies were followed anywhere from 3 months to 58 years later. She once again looked at peer contact and the quality of peer, including romantic relationships. So here's what she found. Having few social relationships was related to premature death. Now it's about 20% higher. These are relative risks, but more likely to experience premature death. That was just a little bit less than the effects of 6 or more alcoholic drinks a day on the effects of premature death. The effects of having poor quality social relationships just about doubled your risk of premature death. And that was stronger than the effects of having 20 or more cigarettes a day. So having poor social relationships is just as bad for your physical health, for your mortality, as having 20 or more cigarettes a day. How much time and energy and dollars are spent on teaching people not to smoke? How much time and energy is spent on teaching people to have good quality social relationships? Was this effect driven by the elderly? No. Her findings demonstrated there was no moderated effect of age group in any of her analyses. So this was, and also many things were controlled. So having started off this idea that perhaps there's a connection between our peer relationships and our health, including our morbidity and our mortality, I wanted to spend the rest of my time today talking about 3 potential mechanisms to explain how this might happen, because each of these mechanisms is very relevant to understanding peer relationships and the study that we can be doing in clinical child and adolescent psychology. I'm going to start by talking about the effects of peers on health risk behaviors, which obviously could then have an effect on morbidity or mortality. So we know that health risk behaviors, of course, are associated with a wide range of different diseases and health challenges in adolescence and in adulthood. We also know this co-occurs with a variety of psychiatric symptoms. Oops, sorry, it's going the wrong way. And usually we talk about things like substance use, which there's quite a lot of research on looking at the effects of peers on substance use, but also there are other health risk behaviors that are very rarely studied in this context for peer relationships. For instance, when we look at sexual risk behaviors, we see 500,000 teenage pregnancies annually. We see more HIV for young individuals than any other age group. We see 9 million new STIs reported annually, and so on. And these numbers have gone down a little bit as kids are using social media more, but nevertheless, still a very big concern. Why don't we study peers in the context of sexual risk behaviors very much? If you ask adolescents who it is that they're having sex with, the vast majority are going to tell you it's another human being. And that human being is probably a peer around their age. So we should really be studying this a lot more. We also should be doing a lot more work to understand the effects of peers on other health risk behaviors, for instance, weight management behaviors. This will be a surprise to absolutely no one who was brought up, who identified as an adolescent female growing up, but as an adolescent male, as I was growing up, this was very surprising to me. The number of kids who are reporting high levels of body dissatisfaction or unhealthy behavior to manage body shape is remarkably high. The number of adolescents who are reporting fasting, diet pills, vomiting, or interest in anabolic steroids, which tends to lean a little bit more towards males, is also remarkably high. Is this relevant to peers? Absolutely. This is exactly who adolescents are comparing themselves to, eating lunch with, going out to get snacks with, or engaging in fat talk with. So what are the ways in which we can better understand the role of peer relationships and how it is that adolescents may develop these health risk behaviors? Well, there's actually a number of different mechanisms here. It is the case that peer rejection is related to deviant peer group affiliation, which might lead to a variety of health risk behaviors, particularly substance use. But another way in which we might understand the effects of peers would be to understand peer influence. If peers are experiencing the belief that others are engaging in similar behaviors. It's a remarkably powerful motivator of adolescents themselves engaging in those same behaviors increasingly over time. We can see that with a variety of different types of peer prototypes. Best friends are most frequently studied, high status peers, romantic partners, and also we're influenced by our low status peers because we want to do the opposite of whatever it is that we think they're doing. And that process is particularly nefarious because it is still conformity. It's just a process of anti-conformity. So when we talk about peer influence and the ways in which we emulate our peers, this comes from a strong developmental social neuroscience tradition now that we can understand why this is happening. I think now many people are familiar with the idea that there is an increase in the number of receptors for oxytocin and for dopamine that makes a nice little cocktail that makes kids think that their parents are totally lame right around the time they become 11 or 12. And instead, they really, really want that peer feedback, that social feedback. But as much as they are driven biologically to really want to do whatever they can to get approval by their peers, the brain's brakes have not been developed yet to stop them from doing so inappropriately. Peer influence is a topic that has been also around for a very long time, since around the 70s or so. But we're kind of a little bit stuck in this area of research right now. There's a lot of research still asking the basic questions of homophily. Is it the case that the similarities we see between adolescents' friends and adolescents themselves is due to selection effects or the tendency to pick friends with similar interests and behavioral hobbies, or to socialization, the extent to which we might see adolescents' friends influencing adolescents' own behavior over time? The reason why we keep on asking this question for 50 years over and over is because we have far too much concurrent data on this right now, which you can't distinguish selection versus socialization. We also have some shared method variance problems. Often we ask adolescents, tell me how much of this behavior you've engaged in. Now tell me how much you think your friend has engaged in that same behavior. And then we try and look at the extent to which we see a similarity between adolescents' behavior and their perceptions of their friends' behavior. But social psychology tells us very well that there are many, many reasons why we suck at perceiving our friends' behaviors or anyone else's kind of attitudes and behavioral tendencies. So we need to be looking instead at the extent to which peers' behavior is influential based on peers' own reported behavior. Another problem that we have is that we often use prospective longitudinal designs for us to try and understand peer influence effects. And that's fine, but keep in mind that our longitudinal designs in clinical child and adolescent psychology usually use a convenience type of assessment scheduling. Often we'll go in about once a year and we'll assess kids with a big battery of measures. That means that in year one, we're going to assess kids and we're going to assess their friends' behavior. And usually we'll say, tell me how often you have smoked pot in the past year, which means that time one, from a year ago, all the way up until the day before they come and take your survey. Then a year later, we go back in and we ask adolescents themselves whether they're smoking pot. We control for how much they said they were smoking pot here. And we're using the extent to which their friends smoke pot in time one, which could be 12 months before you went in, to assess how much it has an effect on what happened basically 23 months later, perhaps. So in other words, our analyses, by and large, are looking at whether your friend's engagement in a behavior might predict your target adolescent's behavior maybe 1 year, 364 days ago. This doesn't make sense because many of our socialization effects are likely instantaneous. They're happening over the course of minutes or hours, not over 2 years. So we decided to try and move the field forward by doing a meta-analysis where we can get our hands on every possible study that we could find to try and determine once and for all if even with these limitations, we could find that perhaps there was a socialization effect that was robust and consistent. So in order to do that, we looked for every possible study that was longitudinal. These were kids at time one. We made sure that adolescents' behavior was measured at 2 or more time points, and peers' behavior was reported at an initial time point and not reported by the target or the adolescent. It's not their perceptions, but adolescents' own behaviors. This was done only with many, many, many people over many, many years. And this was an incredibly ambitious task, and huge thanks to the folks who worked so hard on this over literally a decade. Again, there are many different ways to examine peer socialization. There are experimental paradigms, social mimicry paradigms. We were looking at correlational designs. That comes with all the benefits and the limitations to that approach. People can look cross-sectionally or longitudinal. We were looking longitudinal. You can look at perceptions of peers' behavior, as I mentioned, or you can look at peers' own reported behavior. You can also examine increases in similarity among peers. So how much does your pot smoking friend smoke less because you're an abstainer, and how you come together, or how it is that exposure to peers leads to increases in everyone's behavior, which is more traditional in the peer relations research. And as you can see highlighted here in red, we stack the deck to make this as hard as possible for us to find a significant result. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I just got the page proofs for this a couple days ago, and after 10 years, it was probably my happiest page proofs ever. But it's there. We scanned about 6,000 studies, and so on and so on and so on. And we ultimately, for each one of these studies that we got, we looked at cross-lagged regression coefficients, because ultimately what we're looking at is a correlation in this kind of a way. Can we find a relationship between peers' behavior and adolescents' behavior controlling for baseline levels of adolescent behavior? And here's the formula and way that we did that. The analyses were done in a multi-level meta-regression model because we did get a number of different effect sizes from the same studies. So if you had studies where you had 5 time points, you can get a peer influence effect from time 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on. So we did that in a way, don't ask me any questions about this because I can't answer them. But it was but this multi-level meta-regression model allowed us to extract a general omnibus effect size while taking into account the data redundancies and dependencies that occurred because of the multiple uses of sometimes the same data sets or multiple time points within a single data set. We also looked at publication bias. We ultimately got 236 effect sizes. We had about 50,000 participants. Our effect sizes and studies actually did come predominantly from North America and the Netherlands, Go Canada, and some also from the Far East. Ultimately, just as we suspected, people spend about a year between time 1 and time 2. Here is about 13 months or so. And the vast majority of kids were in that adolescent age between about 10 and 15 or so. So as I mentioned, there's not actually a lot of studies that have been examining different kinds of behaviors. We see most peer influence researchers on substance use. We see this vague problem behavior, which is any kind of externalizing behavior that is not substance use or straight up regression. There has been some research on depression and other internalizing behaviors. There's an old research out there on academic behaviors, and then a little miscellaneous here, despite all that we could be seeing if we looked at sexual behaviors and weight-related behaviors and more, and self-injurious behaviors and so on. So our average effect size, what we got, here's what our graphs look like. We ended up getting a small but statistically significant effect size, 0.08. That at first, we were kind of like, that's not as large as we would have expected. What do we make of that? But because we used a cross-lagged multiple regression model, we ended up benchmarking this in the literature to get a sense of how large this would be. This is actually the same effect size that is found between self-esteem and depression, between positive emotionality and depression, negative, and between attachment and substance use. So it's actually a pretty large effect size when you're looking for correlational kinds of research using the cross-lag model that we found. We did not find moderators. We looked so many for type of behavior and they were not there. We did find that if you studied peer relations effects with smaller windows of time, so less than a year, you are more likely to have a higher peer relationships effect size. And we did find a curvilinear effect for age where that middle adolescent period is more likely to be significant than very early young kids or very old kids. And funnel plots revealed no evidence of publication bias. So where do we go from here? So, we know that socialization happens. We know that kids' peer relationships puts them into contexts where they're going to be engaging in risky behaviors, also positive behaviors, but risky behaviors because of their friends. But we know that not every kid does what their friends do. What's really, really important for future directions is to start studying the moderators of peer influence effects. And some of that's been looked at already. We've looked at things like family factors or self-esteem, and that could be moderators of peer influence. What we've done less is look at whether there exists a construct of peer influence susceptibility. Is there the case that we have a susceptibility to our environment kind of factor? This may be neurologically determined. It may be based on environmental factors, but we know almost nothing about the determinants of susceptibility or even the ways that we can measure susceptibility. The reason why is because we don't have very many ways to measure peer influence susceptibility. What we know is that this is probably different than moderators. So in other words, if you have low self-esteem, that is not the same thing as saying that you have a high level of peer influence susceptibility. It might be a factor that predicts you having more peer influence susceptibility, but that's something a little bit different here. Sorry, this is not going to look good on without animation. Let me just move this out of the way. We don't know how to measure this. We have self-report indices about, are you susceptible to your peers? Are you influenced by your peers? But that doesn't necessarily work very well, right? Adolescents really hate saying that they're susceptible to their peers. It also involves a metacognitive awareness that people that we predict are really low and are high in peer influence susceptibility actually would have the worst metacognitive skills in order to report that they think that they are susceptible to peers. And it's probably based on an implicit level process. Like we said, social psych suggests that many of these factors happen through social mimicry processes. We don't even know what are occurring, so we certainly can't self-report them. We can develop performance-based measurements, however, in order to look at peer influence. And this is cool, because this is where we can take clinical child and adolescent psychology, and we can get all like experimental social psychology on it, which is really fun and different from the way we often do our work. For instance, Joe Allen at University of Virginia developed a Mars test. He asked which 7 of our 12-stranded people in outer space would you choose to bring back to Earth? He asked adolescents to report this, their response alone, and then they bring in either a friend or a confederate, and then they see how many kids the kid changes their decision on once they're in the presence of that peer. The number of kids that the child changes their mind about is perhaps due to susceptibility. So we see they use that as a measure of susceptibility. We have also developed a performance-based measure over many, many years now. It's a simulated chat room. It was actually developed back in 2000 at Yale when Andy was back there as a student, and Survivor had just come out, and we said, how do we get people to vote folks off the island, but do it over a computer? Now this is much more common. But what we did was we had kids join a computerized chat room. If you can imagine back then, it was probably a computer the size of a Volkswagen, you know, but somehow we had programmed this thing to make it look like you were in a room with 3 other kids around your age. Of course, those were not actually other kids. They were all computer programmed to, they would always respond before the participant. We told folks that's randomly, you have been picked as number 4, but in fact, they were always number 4. So they could see what their peers said before they answered each question based on pre-tests, and then on testing where we saw what they said after they viewed their peers. We were able to look at their own change in responses in the presence of their peers. We've administered this now over many grants, over many states, over a couple of different countries actually, and it's gone really well. Let me show you a little bit of what it looks like. We start off by doing a sociometric assessment so we can get an idea of who in the entire grade is liked most and least popular, who's friends with whom. We give them a pre-test assessment, a risk-taking scenarios so we can get local norms for how risky these kids are by gender and ethnicity in that school. And we also use that as the pre-test. Then they enter the chat room. The chat room looks like a web designer. You can see this is an old one. Netscape, Firefox, do they have those anymore? This is an old slide. But it looks like they're entering into our internet browser. They're not. This is just part of the computer program. And it looks like they are going to be participating in our chat room called Teen to Teen in their school 4 people in the same room, them and 3 other students, same gender, same grade. They have to hit enter to continue. They see all kinds of screens like buffering, waiting, loading, connecting, hold on, and all the lights and colors and dots change and everything. They finally get somewhere like this. Now, for IRB, we can't list actual names of people, but we can list the first names and last initials of people that are identified as friends. We learned early on that adolescents themselves don't know how to write capital and then a capital for the last initial. In fact, they're all very confused by what initials are. So they write Marco.R because that's the way they think they're supposed to do it. So we now change this. So we write it with the same kinds of weird typos and language that they do it, but we write the names of people that our pre-testing told us were really, really popular and likable, or in this case, maybe not very popular and likable, to convey whether they're in a chat room where they see people who they want to emulate or they might not want to emulate. Adolescents do the same thing in real life, and what they write appears here based on computer programming. We also have them indicate their hobbies, which conveys likability or not. This would indicate popularity. If we want to indicate not popularity, we say hanging out with my parents or reading, which is sad, but true. And then we ask them things like a sexual health risk behavior. You're kissing your boyfriend, girlfriend. He, she wants to more than kiss. This is in a day where we were being gender binary. This would probably be updated today. You don't want to go too far, but he, she is really pressuring you to do more. How likely are you to get more physical with your partner, even if it includes having sex? We have their pretest response. Then they see, and timing that simulates real life responses, they see their peers indicate that they would be very likely to do it. And then we see what they write in here as the dependent variable. We compare that to what they said on a pretest, and we have our measure of susceptibility. Sophie Chukas-Bradley, quick shout out to her for doing some great research on this. She looked at changes in adolescents' response from before the chat room to during the chat room in 71 adolescents. She used that as an indicator of susceptibility, and then used adolescents' perceptions of how much popular peers engage in risky sex times adolescents' own susceptibility to see if it predicted adolescents' actual trajectories of sexual behavior over 2 years. It did. Combination of thinking that popular kids engage in lots of sex with many partners and you thinking being highly susceptible in this measure of this experimental measure predicted much steeper trajectories of adolescents' own sexual risk behaviors over 4 time points. So peer influence susceptibility is an area where we need a lot more research, but we don't know. Is it a state or a trait? Is it conceptually distinct from other risk factors? Is it related to sociotropy? Is it related to fears of ostracism? Might it be related to neural markers? We have a grant right now to look at that very last piece. In fact, we've recently, this is not our data, but we have data just like this. But here is some data actually out there where college students were asked to indicate their food preferences. When they saw that their peers agreed with them, there was activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and the ventral striatum, showing that there was social reward kind of activation. Well, sure, that makes perfect sense. But what they found was that some kids had higher levels of activation in this area and some had lower levels. The extent to which you had variability in these levels was related to a higher likelihood of changing your scores to match peers more on the second set of trials. And we have similar data from our lab on adolescents now. I'm going to really quickly mention the last 2 mechanisms to talk a little bit about some ways in which peers might be affecting health. One, of course, is looking at stress responses. Problems with peers and peer stress changes our bodies in ways we're only just starting to understand, but that would change our susceptibility to morbidity and mortality. I'm talking about biological stress responses specifically, although there's been so much on psychological stress responses. And there's been a lot of work recently, including a great set of reviews from Diana Marie Close, to really look at a wide array of stress responses. I'm just going to really quickly talk about the HPA axis, which I know many people are familiar with, which can be looked at as diurnal cortisol or cortisol reactivity. Of course, we know that cortisol is not just related to psychopathology, it's also related to health. Having too much cortisol release or too little are related to a variety of different kinds of health risk outcomes. Diurnal cortisol is measured by looking at the extent to which we have a predictable variation in our daily levels of cortisol that provide us with a reservoir on which to draw upon for our stress responses. Reactive cortisol is when we stress someone out, like in the lab with a TSST, for instance, and see whether your cort responses work the way we would want a shock absorber to work, where you see some response and then some return to baseline. Tone Sillison did some really great work looking at diurnal cortisol. He looked at fourth graders and he tried to look at changes in cortisol over the course of the day, looking at their profiles. This was specifically looking at a contrast between morning levels and evening levels, which should show among most people this nice drop. That would be normative. What he found, though, was that those who were excluded and had low friendship quality, those are the same ones that had twice as likely to die, remember, prematurely. That group showed a much flatter level of their diurnal cortisol, suggesting that there's really something going on with peers potentially being related to peer stress, being related to cort effects. Casey Calhoun in the lab, another shout out, did some great research looking at the extent to which we show a stress reactive response in the face of social stress, and also how quickly we return to baseline or stress regulation following that stressor. And he did that in our sample, looking at peer victimization as a predictor, and a bunch of kids that we brought in and did the trier. We controlled for all kinds of typical cort things there. Really quick shout out, thank you to Matt Nock, Paul Hastings, Karen Rudolph, who were part of this project. This is an old one that we finished about 7 years ago now, but it was a great opportunity to look at this research question. Many people on here who now are all in their late 60s and 70s, but really were very helpful working with me back in the day. We got some good IKEA furniture, turned a really ugly psychology department into a nice little adolescent lounge. The adolescents hang out, talk with one another, and also get up and make a speech in front of a TV. We brought them in, we engaged a number of questionnaires, we got some baseline cort, capturing the moment at which they were watching some nice, easy videos. We got heart rate monitoring, and we also captured, with cort samples about 15, 20 minutes later, moments that captured their anticipation just before their speech started, and then several time points later to see how they regulated afterwards. Well, here's what happened. You want to see, like a good shock absorber, that you get a little bit of a bounce, right? You want to see some reaction, and then you want to see that return to baseline. What he found when looking at our reactivity was that there was less reactivity among those with high relational victimization in our sample. So having peer problems made you less likely to show the nimbleness in your cort responses. And that's not good. That's more of a blunted, flat response, indicative of having a lot of lifetime stress. Interestingly, relational victimization predicted above and beyond all kinds of other stressors that we had controlled for. So there's something unique about peer stress that adds incremental explained variance. When we looked at regulation, so here we were controlling for our reactivity, who's most likely to return to baseline and who's most likely to not return to baseline. It's a double negative, but it's the high negative friendship quality. So those who had high levels of poor relationships, they barely recovered at all. So they got a double whammy there. Poor reactivity and less likely to recover when they did have reactivity, really showing this difficulty of peer stress. There's so many other peer constructs beyond victimization we could be looking at to understand stress responses, but the peer relations people really rarely look at any of these kinds of measures, like heart rate or galvanic skin response, or I can name dozens. We rarely look at this at different developmental levels to look for developmental sensitivity periods, and we rarely look at how this might be moderated by a range of potential cultural factors. It also could be that there's a more direct link in the way that we see peers affecting our morbidity or mortality. And this is really coming from research on human social genomics, which is a really cool area that I am continually fascinated by. The research starts by trying to piece together an evolutionary puzzle that starts about 60,000 years ago. I didn't know any of this. I didn't learn any of this in graduate school, but it turns out that we were not the only human-like species roaming around the earth. There was us, mostly in Africa and also in Southern Europe, but there were Neanderthals and I can't even pronounce these, and Denisovans and Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, and probably others as well. Well, here's the deal. We shouldn't be here right now. We were not the biggest. We were not the toughest. We were not the hardiest to cold temperatures and long bouts of hunger. Why are we here? There's no good reason except one. Anthropologists suggest that there was one advantage we had that no one else had. And that was a weird genetic mutation that changed the shape of our larynx. It also came along with a little bit of a change in an area of the brain that we all learned about in brain and behavior, our psychobio classes in graduate school. Thank you, APA accreditation. That changed our ability to understand unique sounds. It was the beginning of our language centers in the brain, right? And so we could grunt a little bit more sophisticated than all these yutzes could. And what that meant was that we could start to communicate. And as we could communicate, we became a social species. We could warn one another when there were predators coming. We could work together to try and hunt. We could eat all of our food at one sitting, kill all of our kill as one big group and not die of salmonella by dragging its carcass around and eating it over the next month. There were lots of advantages that came, and there are lots of ways that our bodies still show the effects of us being used to working together as a group. That kind of herd mentality, which we've heard a lot about now as we talk about things like herd immunity, is actually something that we still see some really sensitive signals in the brain and elsewhere in the body as well. So anyone that remembers kind of the work on social pain, which is now a little bit older, but I think is still super cool and a really good area for peer relations, probably remembers this very antique Atari-looking video game called Cyberball, where you had the impression that you were throwing a ball between two other folks who turned out to be Confederates. The ball had a nerdy little sigh on it, and at some point, the other two people in the experiment just started throwing the ball to each other and not to you. And you're like, hey, what's up? You were just throwing the ball with me. Now I feel excluded. Even though it's a little computer game and you're laying in an fMRI, it kind of works. You feel excluded. Well, the areas of the brain that started to show activation at that moment were similar to the areas that are shown during physical pain. Now, to say that, if you're not familiar with this literature, let me briefly say, there are actually two areas. The sensory cortex that makes that tingling or hurtful sensation, makes you say, ow, yikes, that hurt. But there's a second part of the brain that indicates kind of our brain's alarm system to say, whatever you're doing right now, stop and do the opposite. So if you've got your hand on a fire, you don't just say, ow, that hurts. You also move your hand really fast, right? And that's your brain telling you, like, immediately change what you're doing. Well, when you feel social exclusion, your brain tells you, change what you're doing right now. It is the highest warning signal you can get. This has lethal consequences if you're excluded. Isn't that cool? Our peer relations are so important that our brain tells us that we need to give it its biggest warning sign. Where's all the peer relations research looking at social pain and peer rejection or peer victimization or different developmental levels or different cultural levels? That would be super cool, I think. And I just said all of that. The thing that's really interesting is that social sensitivity and pain sensitivity overlap in really cool ways. NSSI research has shown us that NSSI creates a physical pain offset, and it actually takes away our emotional pain. That's why it's so hard to get people to stop engaging in NSSI, because the offset of physical pain produces an offset of social pain at the same time. Also, Tylenol makes you feel better after a breakup. That's actual research showing that other things that shut off our physical pain actually lead to some emotional or social pain that we experience, probably the same mechanisms. We have so much more research that we can do in this area. But there's more. We also know from human social genomics that when we experience that exclusion and that neural response, it has a lot of downstream consequences. So you probably know that while you have been sitting here, many of your cells have died and regenerated over just the course of these last 40 minutes. Hopefully really good ones have developed as a result of this talk, but nevertheless, others have died. And when they have regenerated, they have generated based on your DNA. Well, Not all of our DNA is used to make all of our cells. In fact, there are many cells that, many of our DNA that's kind of pre-installed, like when you buy a new computer and it has all that annoying commercial software on there that you have to uninstall. It's already on there. It doesn't get turned on unless there's a reason for it to get turned on. Well, we have some inflammation set of DNA that gets us ready to have a pro-inflammation response. At the moment that we feel social rejection, it turns on. In fact, we've been doing it in the lab. We bring young kids in, we freak them out, we take blood before and after, and in 40 minutes, we can see DNA has just been expressed, just based on us giving them a tree or social stress test. It's really cool. We also see that their viral immunity shuts off. Again, right in that 40 minutes. And why would our bodies do this? For the same reason. If it used to be that getting kicked out of the cave and being made to hang out on your own 100 yards away meant that you were going to get trampled by a woolly mammoth, then your body needed to prepare you to heal from that inflammation response. You were going to get infections, you were going to get sick, you were going to get your arm gnawed off by some sort of a yak, and you needed to be able to fight off inflammation. But you didn't need viral immunity because you weren't around anyone anymore. Very easy to explain during COVID, right? If you're not around anyone anymore, you're not going to get a virus. So to save energy, your viral immunity goes down. And this is all depicted here, suggesting that this change in our pro-inflammation response and our drop in viral immunity actually can have effects, obviously, in physical health. But I'm going to swing it back here a little bit to mental health by talking about, by mentioning the process of glucocorticoid resistance, which means that this high inflammation response is changing our serotonin synthesis, and it can lead to depression. Inflammatory diseases and depression are highly comorbid, perhaps for this reason. Oops. We used some of our data to look at this very question. Like I mentioned, we freaked these kids out. We did also, over time, a life stress interview to find out what actual stressors they experienced in their real life. And then we looked at depression every 3 months. We therefore were able to look at whether real life interpersonal stress predicts depression, also suicide. Yes, it does, we know that. But the extent to which you show a dramatic pro-inflammation response might lead to a higher likelihood, stronger relationship between stress and depression than if you have a lower cytokine or pro-inflammation response. That's exactly what happened. Using salivary measures of cytokine reactivity, which are flawed, so please keep those limitations in mind, we found and finally published that high levels of reactivity on cytokines demonstrating that pro-inflammation response times high level of interpersonal stress led to increases in depressive symptoms. Similarly, some nice biological resilience here. If you had high levels of interpersonal stress, but you didn't show high levels of pro-inflammation physiological reactivity, not a big increase in depression. We saw that that worked in a three-way interaction when looking at that in combination with advanced puberty as well. Really, again, demonstrating something very unique to that adolescent time period. Well, I'm about at the end of the hour, so I wanted to just quickly say that I think that there's tons more that we can do to look at peers and psychopathology for sure. But there's so much potential for us to say that peer relations and psychology matters, and it matters to physical health. So all those funders out there and all those conservative Congress people that hate research and psychology, let's tell them psychosocial experiences and psychology and peer relationships matter to things that everyone cares about, like physical health that doesn't have the stigma that mental health sometimes unfortunately does. And there's so many potential mechanisms, which means that more of those institutes out there, not just NIMH, are open to you if you're interested in studying these topics. There's so much more that we can do. I haven't even gotten into talking about how the electronic world of peer relationships can change all of this so much more. But hopefully you see a huge area here for future directions that would really take what's been done in the last 50 years and expand it in so many fundable and exciting ways. Thanks so much again to Andy and for the committee that put together the Future Directions Forum panel for inviting me. And I hope that this has been a helpful overview of an area that I know I'm very excited about.